When the mercury plummets to 40 below modern technology dies, the people of Crestwood laughed when a local hermit smeared rendered animal fat across his window panes. They called him a lunatic. But when a record-shattering blizzard turned their luxury homes into frozen tombs, he became their only chance at survival. The smell hit the valley long before the first snowflakes fell. It was a thick, heavy odor, like roasting meat mixed with the sharp medicinal tang of pine sap. It drifted down from the upper ridge, settling over the affluent mountain enclave of Crestwood, Colorado, and wrinkling the noses of its wealthy residents. The source of the stench was Arthur Pendleton. At 68, Arthur was a relic of a bygone era. While Crestwood had transformed over the last 2 decades from a rugged logging outpost into a playground for tech millionaires and remote executives, Arthur remained stubbornly anchored to the past. He lived in a hand-hewn timber cabin on 20 acres of rocky vertical land that overlooked the sprawling glass-fronted mansions below. He was a retired land surveyor and a former wilderness guide who had spent more nights sleeping under a canvas tarp than under a roof. It was mid-October when Arthur began his annual, yet unusually aggressive winter preparations. The local wildlife had been acting strange. The elk had migrated down into the lower valleys 3 weeks earlier than usual, moving with a panicked urgency. The woolly bear caterpillars were entirely black, devoid of their usual brown bands. But it was the silence in the woods that truly put Arthur on edge. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. Arthur knew a widowmaker winter was coming. He had survived the catastrophic freeze of 1982, an event that had buried towns and snapped power grids across the Rockies, and he knew that Crestwood, with its over-reliance on fragile electric infrastructure and smart home technology, was entirely unprepared. So he went to work. He spent 2 weeks gathering raw sweat from local butchers in the neighboring county and bartering with hunters for bear and deer fat. In a massive cast-iron cauldron over an outdoor fire pit, Arthur rendered the fat. He stood in the biting autumn wind, stirring the boiling, bubbling mass with a wooden oar. Once the fat was rendered down to pure tallow and grease, he stirred in blocks of raw beeswax and a thick slurry of pine pitch he had harvested from the surrounding woods. When the mixture cooled, it formed a dense, semi-translucent paste that was incredibly sticky, totally waterproof, and practically impervious to temperature fluctuations. Down in the town, the rumors started flying. Sarah Billings, the owner of the artisanal coffee shop on Main Street, was the first to complain about the smell. "It's like someone is running a primitive soap factory up there," she muttered to Mayor Jonathan Brooks as she handed him his morning latte. "Can't the town do something about the zoning?" Mayor Brooks, a man whose primary concern was keeping property values sky high, just sighed. Arthur is grandfathered in Sarah. He's harmless, just a bit eccentric. The eccentricity reached its peak when Arthur drove his rusted 1990 Ford F-150 into town to visit the Crestwood hardware supply. The store was owned by Henry Fletcher, a pragmatic man who usually humored Arthur's odd purchases. 20 rolls of industrial burlap arty," Henry asked, raising an eyebrow as he rang up the purchase. "You starting a potato sack racing league?" Arthur didn't smile. His face, weathered like old saddle leather, was dead serious. "Insulation, Henry. The pipes. And I need a dozen panes of unglazed storm glass." Henry chuckled, leaning over the counter. "Artie, we've got state-of-the-art fiberglass wrap in aisle 4. We've got closed-cell foam tubing. You don't need burlap. Foam cracks when the air turns to ice." Arthur grunted, handing over a wad of crumpled cash. "Nature's been keeping animals alive in the cold for 1,000,000 years. I'll stick to what works." Over the next few days, the teenagers of Crestwood found a new source of entertainment. They drove their electric SUVs up the winding dirt road to the edge of Arthur's property to film his bizarre behavior. Arthur was methodically applying the rendered animal fat mixture to his windows. He didn't just caulk the edges, he smeared a half-inch thick layer of the yellowish paste directly onto the outer window frame, then pressed a secondary pane of glass right into the fat, sealing it with a final coat around the perimeter. The trapped air between the panes combined with the dense, hydrophobic thermal break of the fat and beeswax created an insulating barrier that no modern window could rival. The fat blocked the drafts, while the beeswax prevented the mixture from completely freezing solid, allowing the wood frame to flex without shattering the glass. Next, he took the burlap. He soaked the heavy fabric in the boiling tallow mixture until it was completely saturated, then dragged the steaming, greasy cloth into his basement and crawl spaces. He wrapped every single exposed water pipe in 3 thick layers of the fat-soaked burlap, tying it off with twine. The fat repelled moisture, preventing condensation from forming and freezing on the metal, while the dense mass trapped the latent heat of the water inside. A video of Arthur smearing grease on his house went viral on a local Facebook group. Diane Gable, a freelance writer for the Crestwood Chronicle, penned a sarcastic op-ed titled "Pioneer Paranoia: Why One Resident is Preparing for the Ice Age with Bare Grease." The town collectively snickered. They sat in their radiant floor-heated homes, adjusting their thermostats from their smartphones, and mocked the crazy old man on the hill who had turned his cabin into a greasy, opaque eyesore. But Arthur just watched the sky. The clouds were gathering, and they were the color of bruised iron. The meteorological anomaly was completely missed by the long-range forecast models until it was 48 hours away. In mid-January, a sudden and violent stratospheric warming event occurred over the Arctic Circle. This caused the polar vortex, the massive ring of freezing air that usually stays confined to the North Pole, to split. A colossal lobe of dense, ultra-frozen air broke off and began a rapid, unobstructed plunge southward, funneled directly down the spine of the Rocky Mountains. Meteorologists scrambled, issuing frantic emergency alerts, but by the time the magnitude of the storm was understood, it was already too late to evacuate. The National Weather Service called it a once-in-a-century pressure drop. In Crestwood, the day began deceptively normal. It was a crisp 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and Mayor Brooks was busy finalizing the catering for the town's annual Winter Solstice Gala, scheduled to be held in the massive glass-walled atrium of the country club. At 2 p.m., the wind stopped entirely. The sky, which had been a pale winter blue, abruptly shifted to a terrifying bruised purple. Then the temperature fell off a cliff. It didn't drop gradually. It plummeted with the violence of a physical blow. Within 2 hours, the mercury dove from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By 6 p.m., a blinding sideways snow began to fall, driven by 70-mile-per-hour winds that sounded like freight trains screaming through the valley. The wind chill hit minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit. At first, the residents of Crestwood simply turned up their thermostats. Fireplaces were lit, wine was poured, and people watched the raging blizzard through their floor-to-ceiling, double-paned, argon-filled luxury windows. They felt secure in their expensive fortresses. But extreme cold of this magnitude operates by its own set of physics. It aggressively seeks out heat, probing every microscopic gap in modern construction. The first failure happened at the regional substation. The sheer volume of thousands of homes simultaneously pushing their HVAC systems to maximum capacity, combined with the extreme shrinking of high-tension power lines in the cold, caused a catastrophic fault. At 8:14 p.m., a massive blue flash illuminated the stormy sky above the valley, followed by a sickening hum and then absolute darkness. The power grid was dead. Panic was minimal at first. Most of the mansions in Crestwood were equipped with automated backup generators. The deep hum of diesel and natural gas engines echoed through the snowy neighborhoods as the lights flickered back on. But Henry Fletcher, sitting in his darkened hardware store, knew the truth. He looked at the thermometer hanging outside his window. It read -38 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was still dropping. The diesel, he whispered to himself in horror. Standard winter blend diesel fuel begins to gel and turn into a useless, waxy sludge around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Without specialized block heaters and chemical anti-gel additives, which almost no one in Crestwood had bothered to stockpile, the generators were doomed. By midnight, the mechanical hums across the valley began to sputter and die. One by one, the luxury homes went dark again. Propane tanks fared no better. The extreme cold caused the liquid inside to lose pressure, rendering the vapor useless. Inside the homes, the cold seeped in with terrifying speed. Those beautiful, expensive, floor-to-ceiling windows became massive liabilities, radiating the interior heat straight out into the blizzard. The indoor temperatures plummeted into the 30s, then the 20s. Then came the sound that would haunt the town for years. Crack. Bang. Hiss. It started in the expansive basement of Mayor Brooks's estate. His modern PEX plumbing, running through standard foam-insulated exterior walls, didn't stand a chance. The water inside the pipes froze, expanding with unstoppable force. A junction blew apart like a gunshot. Gallons of pressurized water spewed into the basement, only to freeze into a solid sheet of ice within minutes, permanently destroying the home's electrical panel and HVAC units. Across Crestwood, the symphony of destruction echoed in the dark. Toilets shattered. Hot water heaters ruptured. The spray foam insulation that contractors had sworn by contracted in the bitter cold, pulling away from the studs and allowing the -40 degrees Fahrenheit air to pour directly onto copper piping. Deputy Carl Ramirez was huddled in his cruiser, keeping the engine running, just to stay alive, as the frantic dispatch calls came in. But he couldn't do anything. The roads were buried under 4 feet of snow, and the plow's hydraulics had frozen solid at the depot. People were trapped in their freezing homes, wrapped in useless decorative throw blankets, watching their breath turn to steam in their living rooms. Meanwhile, high up on the ridge, Arthur Pendleton sat in his rocking chair, reading a worn paperback by the light of a kerosene lamp. His cabin was a balmy 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The roaring fire in his massive cast-iron stove was working efficiently, but the real heroes were his windows and his pipes. The animal fat and beeswax mixture had hardened into a dense, impenetrable armor. It completely stopped the wind from penetrating the old wooden frames. Because the fat was dense and non-porous, it trapped the radiant heat inside the cabin, bouncing it back into the room rather than letting it bleed through the glass. The yellowish hazy windows looked ugly, but they were saving his life. Down in the crawl space, the fat-soaked burlap surrounding his pipes performed a miracle. The dense animal fat retained the ambient heat of the ground and the slow trickle of the water inside. The wax prevented the burlap from freezing into a brittle shell. While the multi-million-dollar homes below were being torn apart by expanding ice, Arthur turned on his kitchen faucet, and water flowed freely into the sink. By dawn on the second day, the situation in Crestwood had shifted from an emergency to a fight for survival. The indoor temperature in most homes had dropped below zero. Cell phone towers, their battery backups drained, and Frozen went offline. The town was cut off from the world. Deputy Ramirez knew people were going to die if they didn't find a centralized heat source. The town hall's pipes had burst, ruining the shelter. He sat in his cruiser, staring up at the ridge. Through the swirling whiteout, he could see a faint, steady glow of yellow light. It was Arthur's cabin. Desperation drove Ramirez. He strapped on a pair of old snowshoes from his trunk and began the grueling, mile-long trek up the mountain. The wind cut through his issued parka like a knife, the cold searing his lungs with every breath. He expected to find Arthur dead, an old man frozen solid in a rustic, uninsulated shack. When Ramirez finally reached the porch, his face numb and his hands losing dexterity, he collapsed against the heavy oak door. He barely had the strength to knock. The door swung open, and a blast of hot, wood-scented air washed over the freezing deputy. Arthur stood there in a flannel shirt and suspenders, holding a steaming mug of coffee. He looked down at the shivering, ice-covered police officer, then out at the frozen, dark valley below. "Pipes burst down there, didn't they, Carl?" Arthur asked quietly. Ramirez could only nod his teeth, chattering violently. "Well, we're freezing, Arthur. Everyone." Arthur sighed, stepping back to let the deputy inside. "Better tell them to start climbing then. I've got enough firewood for a month, and my water's still running." He paused, looking at his greasy, hazy windows. "I suppose they won't be laughing at the smell anymore." Deputy Carl Ramirez sat shivering by the cast-iron stove, wrapping his blistered, frost-nipped fingers around the ceramic mug of black coffee. As the feeling slowly returned to his extremities, in agonizing pins and needles, the grim reality of Crestwood's situation set in. Down in the valley, the remaining residents were trapped in million-dollar iceboxes. Arthur Pendleton didn't waste time with I-told-you-sos. He walked over to a dusty corner of the cabin and pulled a heavy canvas tarp off an old battery-powered ham radio base station. It was a relic from his days coordinating search and rescue teams in the 80s, powered by a deep-cycle marine battery he kept charged via a small wind-powered turbine on the roof. "The modern repeaters are dead, Carl," Arthur said, adjusting the squelch dial until the static hissed sharply. "But the town's emergency broadcast frequency should still trigger the battery-operated weather radios most folks keep in their basements. You need to tell them to move. Now. If they wait for the sun, they'll freeze in their sleep." Ramirez grabbed the microphone. His voice, hoarse and trembling, cut through the static across the dark, freezing valley. "This is Deputy Ramirez. The grid is down permanently. Emergency shelters are compromised. If you can hear this, you must evacuate to Arthur Pendleton's cabin on the upper ridge. Dress in every layer you own. Cover your faces. Do not stop walking. I repeat, head to the ridge." In the dark, shattered remnants of Mayor Jonathan Brooks's estate, the transmission crackled to life from a hand-crank radio. Jonathan stared at it in disbelief. His breath plumed in the freezing air of his grand foyer. Beside him, his wife was bundled in 3 ski parkas, weeping silently. The thought of climbing a mile uphill in a blizzard, seeking refuge from the man they had mercilessly mocked, was a bitter pill. But the temperature in their living room was now 3 degrees above zero. Pride had frozen solid. The exodus began just before midnight. It was a chaotic, desperate migration. Shadows emerged from the darkened mansions, staggering into the roaring, blinding whiteout. The snow was waist-deep, in places turning a standard 30-minute hike into a grueling death march. The wind howled at 70 miles per hour, acting like a physical wall that pushed them backward, stealing the oxygen from their lungs. Sarah Billings, the coffee shop owner who had complained about the smell of Arthur's rendered fat, was dragging a plastic toboggan. Bundled inside it, under layers of blankets, was her 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Sarah's legs were burning her lungs, searing with every intake of the -40-degree air. She was falling behind the main group. "Keep moving, Sarah, do not stop," barked a voice over the roar of the wind. It was Dr. William Harmon, a retired cardiothoracic surgeon who had moved to Crestwood for the golf. William was 65, but the adrenaline of survival had kicked in. He grabbed the rope of the sled, his heavy winter boots kicking through the dense snowdrifts. I can't feel my legs, William. Sarah sobbed, her eyelashes caked in solid ice. You can panic tomorrow, William yelled back, his face completely wrapped in a wool scarf. Tonight we walk. As they crested the final switchback, the wind nearly blew them off their feet. But there, cutting through the swirling vortex of snow, was a glowing amber square. It was Arthur's window. Up close, the window didn't look like a greasy eyesore. It looked like a beacon of absolute salvation. One by one, the elite residents of Crestwood collapsed onto Arthur's wooden porch. Arthur and Ramirez hauled them inside, stripping away frozen outer layers and moving them toward the massive radiant heat of the wood stove. By 3 a.m., 38 people were crammed into a 1,200-square-foot timber cabin. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool melting ice and the faint, unmistakable scent of rendered animal fat. But nobody complained. The ambient temperature in the cabin was a miraculous 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah Billings sat on the floor, holding her unthawed daughter, weeping tears of pure relief. She looked up at the window she had once despised. The thick layer of yellowed sweet and beeswax had hardened into an impenetrable shield, blocking out the shrieking winds. She could see the frost trying to creep in from the corners, only to be stopped completely by the dense, waxy barrier. "Arthur," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. I am so sorry." Arthur simply handed her a steaming bowl of venison broth. "Drink this. The cold makes you burn calories just trying to shiver." Survival in close quarters brings out the absolute core of human nature, stripping away the veneers of wealth and status. By the dawn of the third day, the blizzard outside had not relented. The storm was completely stationary, pummeling the mountain, with a ferocity that defied all meteorological models. Inside the cabin space was the ultimate premium. Arthur had established a strict rationing protocol for firewood, food, and water. Everyone had a job. The billionaires were tasked with chopping potatoes, the tech executives were assigned to stoking the fire, and Dr. William Harmon monitored everyone for signs of pneumonia and severe frostbite. But Mayor Jonathan Brooks was struggling with the loss of control. Used to dictating terms and throwing money at problems, he found Arthur's utilitarian dictatorship infuriating. "Pendleton," Jonathan said, stepping over a row of sleeping bags to confront the old man by the stove. "My wife's back is giving out on that hardwood floor. I'll write you a check for $50,000 right now if you let us use your master bed." The cabin fell dead silent. Everyone looked at Arthur. Arthur slowly placed a cast-iron skillet onto the stove. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly tired. "Jonathan, look out that window," Arthur said, pointing a calloused finger at the waxy, glowing glass. "What do you see?" "Nothing," Jonathan muttered. "It's completely opaque." "You see nature trying to kill us," Arthur corrected. "Out there your checkbook is just kindling. It has zero thermal mass. It won't stop the wind, and it won't keep your blood pumping. The only currency that matters in this room is cooperation and body heat. Your wife takes a shift on the floor like everyone else. If she needs a softer spot, fold up another burlap sack." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he nodded, defeated. He finally understood that the rules of the modern world had been entirely suspended. The ultimate test of Arthur's primitive engineering came on the night of the 4th day. The wind shifted direction, funneling directly down the canyon and hitting the front face of the cabin with an uninterrupted 90-mile-per-hour gust. The structure groaned in agony. The massive exposed timber beams creaked like a ship at sea. Suddenly, a loud, explosive crack echoed through the room. Screams erupted. The sheer negative pressure of the wind had caused the heavy wooden frame of the eastern window to warp inward, snapping the inner pane of glass. A sliver of the primary defense was breached, and instantly a jet of -45 degrees Fahrenheit air screamed into the room like a physical blade. The temperature in the cabin began to plummet within seconds. "It's going to blow out!" William shouted, shielding his face from the flying ice crystals. "Not if we choke it!" Arthur roared over the wind. He grabbed an iron fire poker and smashed open a wooden crate near the door, pulling out a heavy 10-gallon galvanized bucket. Inside was the remaining raw bear tallow and pine pitch mixture, completely frozen solid. "I need heat now! Ramirez Brooks!" Arthur yelled. Jonathan Brooks didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees alongside the deputy. Arthur shoved the bucket practically onto the surface of the roaring stove. "William, grab that spare sheet of plywood from under the bed. Sarah, bring me every scrap of burlap from the pantry," Arthur commanded. As the bottom of the bucket began to sizzle and melt, Arthur didn't wait for it to fully liquefy. He grabbed massive, greasy handfuls of the semi-solid fat. "Hold the plywood over the crack," he ordered Jonathan and William. The two men threw their weight against the board, fighting the terrifying vacuum pressure of the blizzard, trying to suck it out. Arthur, moving with the desperate speed of a man fighting for his life, began smearing the melting animal fat directly around the edges of the plywood, overlapping it onto the shattered window frame. He slapped strips of burlap over the grease, then applied another layer of hot fat, sealing the fabric to the wood. The genius of the concoction became instantly apparent to the terrified onlookers. The moment the hot fat hit the freezing air pouring through the crack, it flash-solidified. The pine pitch and beeswax hardened into a rigid cement-like glue, while the burlap provided structural tension. Within 3 minutes, the howling shriek of the wind was silenced. The seal was absolute. Jonathan Brooks pulled his hands away from the plywood, staring at his palms, which were coated in sticky yellow animal grease. He didn't wipe it off. He looked at Arthur, his chest heaving. "It stopped," Jonathan whispered. "It actually stopped it." "Nature builds the best glue, Jonathan," Arthur said, wiping his own hands on a rag. "We just forgot how to use it." On the morning of the 5th day, the roaring wind finally died. The bruised purple sky gave way to a blinding, crystal-clear blue. When Ramirez finally pushed the front door open, shoving aside a 4-foot drift, the silence was deafening. Crestwood was unrecognizable. The luxury mansions below were entombed in ice. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow. The damage would run into the hundreds of millions of dollars, and it would be months before the grid was fully repaired. Later that afternoon, the rhythmic thumping of National Guard Chinook helicopters echoed through the valley. As the rescue crews rappelled down to the ridge to begin evacuating the survivors, the townspeople of Crestwood lingered on the porch. They looked back at the small, weathered cabin. They looked at the opaque, grease-smeared windows that had saved their lives. Nobody was laughing anymore. Dr. William Harmon shook Arthur's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the debt they owed. Jonathan Brooks didn't offer a check. He offered a genuine, humbled nod. Arthur Pendleton watched the helicopters carry the billionaires away. He stepped back inside his warm cabin, closed the heavy oak door, and threw another log on the fire. Winter was far from over, but he was ready. He always was. Are you prepared for the unexpected, or are you relying entirely on the fragile modern grid? If this intense tale of survival and forgotten pioneer wisdom kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends to see who would survive the freeze, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping real-life survival drama every week.